It's a pleasure to be moderating the last session of the year. So welcome everyone to this year's last CIF seminar. I'm really happy that we have Erik Zouave giving a presentation today. He's going to speak on something that involves dual use of the research that we are doing. And I think many of us in the security field understand that a lot of the work we are doing is kind of inherently dual use. So I'm really excited to understand a little bit more what the situation there is legally and technically. Erik is a consultant with 6 years of experience in compliance analysis training, advising government authority and research institutions. His experience encompasses privacy and data protection law, network and security law, European cybersecurity certification, and standardization. Yeah, I think I don't want to spend much more time on the introduction, and the floor is for Erik. If you want to know what's coming at you next year, please visit the CIF Seminars website. We have a pretty cool line of talks ready for you for next year already. The first one is going to be on the 6th of January, I believe, so right after the break, where we talk about technological testing grounds, migration management experiments from a technical and human rights perspective. That's work between Petra Molnar and partly myself. So I'm also really happy to see that. And now the floor is Erik's, and I wish everyone a joyful presentation. If you have a question, then raise your hand or unmute your mic or put it in the chat, and I'll try to moderate the session a little bit. Till then, please mute, and the floor is yours, Erik.
Thank you. Well, so let's just jump straight into it. Okay, I'm gonna cover a bit of a background, some definitions and examples, some regulatory approaches, and some general mitigations. Some of the mitigations will actually be mixed into the regulatory approaches, because the regulatory approaches tend to have loopholes that, if you want to handle this in an ethical way, and I know that many of you are probably deal with ethics and not just the legal bottom line, then you might want to address those as well. Well, this type of study, I think, would historically have taken off sometime around Arab Spring. That's when news and technical studies from institutions like Citizen Lab, Stanford, etc., started taking off. When you saw that there was mobilization of dissidents in the Middle East, North Africa. They were using social media. They were using everyday communication tools. And governments were then implementing technical tools for repressive ends, or repressive purposes. Civil society and academics and journalists started noting that some of these tools were flowing from Western democracies into areas with repressive policies. And the focus, as this started, was mainly on human rights and the implementation of export controls. Some of the reasons why we know what we know about this type of misuse is because there were technical investigations. Researchers made their own tools to install, for example, on human rights defenders' computers, on journalists' computers, to preempt and see what was going on, see if they were getting infected, see if data was being exported, to where in the world it was being exported, to try to identify which tools, technical tools, are being used, and so on. And a lot of it comes from leaks, unlawful leaks, hacks of companies. Some of the more prominent companies that was hacked was one called Finfisher, Gamma, which creates lawful hacking solutions, and Hacking Team, also a intermediary of lawful hacking solutions. And I'll get into what that means as well. I think that if you are interested in the technical side of the industrialization of these types of solutions, where they have spread and what they do on someone's computer, then the Citizen Lab has made really awesome research and tools for you to get this type of information. And more as these types of revelations came out, legal complaints started, and they are still in process, and most of them unresolved. So we have, just looking at these types of companies who are providing lawful hacking solutions for, say, police and intelligence and military. We're looking at 8 complaints against intermediaries, 2 complaints against their government customers, spanning 8 years and 5 different jurisdictions. And they regard subject matters such as export control, harassment, and varying forms of accusations of cybercrime. So we have had a growing amount of complaints against what is allegedly misuse in this domain. Now you can, of course, ask, well, if this is something which is done at industrial scale by companies, say, what does it have to do with me as a researcher? Well, there are many types of researchers. There are researchers that do fundamental research. There are researchers that are associated with academic institutions. And then there are also other types of researchers. Researchers that are security researchers in a more practical sense, still doing research though, doing applied research. There are researchers that are associated with private corporations, that are associated with government entities. There are many types of researchers out there. And there are many types of people that you as a researcher will be interacting with through your career. And researchers have some things in common here, or have some trends in common, and that's you have insights into security and mitigations. You are developers of technologies. You are drivers in technology maturity. You are transparent, probably more so than many of the other actors that are active in this domain. You like to publish what you find because that's how you make a career, whereas other actors in this domain do not. So you are a go-to source for someone who wants to have a look and to know more about what's coming next in technology development and how you can do things and solve technological problems. You have varied means of employ or customers or financiers. You are potentially knowing or unknowing collaborators of repressive interests. And you or someone you know, someone you are collaborating with or someone you work with could be committing a crime, unfortunately. So that's some of the bottom lines here, why this is relevant for you. Where can misuse start? So the little desk here symbolizes places where you might actually find someone doing research in some way. There are, of course, individual researchers who sit by themselves, who are not in the employ, but are consultants, maybe for their own firms. There are criminal organizations. There are brokers. Brokers can have in-house researchers, even though they probably mostly buy externally information that they want to resell. You have research institutes. You have industry that need to develop, that need to maintain relevance on the market, that hire researchers. You have governments that hire researchers as well. Of course, all of this is not bad. All of this is not misuse. Far from it. Most of it is quite good if you discount the criminal organizations, which are always bad. But a careless researcher is a security threat. An uninformed or criminal researcher is a security threat. A broker that deals with information that is sensitive or that could cause harm, that doesn't have due diligence in place, is a threat. Someone who accepts offense, someone who is willing to bust embargoes, is a security threat. Someone who is funded by repressive interests is a potential security threat. Someone who is potentially owned or partially owned by repressive interests is a security threat, someone who is allied and who is trying to get ahead of, say, a problem like terrorism, and who is willing to bypass human rights standards to get the information they need from a government somewhere far away where, say, terrorism is stemming from, is a security threat when they decide to let go of the standards that they hold themselves to. And there are many ways that research findings and security-sensitive materials can come to be disseminated amongst these types of actors. Careless publication, irresponsible disclosure, and many others. One of the key themes that I was asked to present on was what is offensive cyber technologies. If you look into academia, especially the one which is prominently on the military side of things, which is where you typically find language like offensive being used in a cyber context, you will find a very reductive definition. You will find a definition that almost excludes anything that has to do with information gathering, and thereby excluding probably above 90% of anything done in cyberspace, which is mostly information theft and information gathering and whatnot, to the most fantastic cases of attacks on systems, denying, degrading, disrupting. And arguably, in a military context, if you want to be consistent with prior doctrine of what military operations are, you are probably right to make such a reductive definition, because you're looking at something that projects power, where you're aiming to gain momentum, attain interest, achieve goals, influence, or preempt the actives of an adversary. You're looking at something which employs feints and exploitations to do so. But obviously, offensive is, in the everyday sense of the term and how it's used in a dictionary, is not just about what military organizations do. It's the intent or the attempt at attacking someone with a weapon. So that's usually in a criminal manner in that sense. So the idea of how widely do we define this definition as a marker of how something that we work on might be misused is, well, it depends. If you go with the military definition, you're probably going to have a very comfortable way of working with things, because then you're probably not dealing with something that is offensive, most of you. But if you widen this to the spectrum to where you get to criminal misuse, criminal conduct, you have a much broader range of scenarios and much broader range of technical characteristics that you are actually working with in the end. Something that tends to be familiar in the cyber context is the use of categorizing what is being done during an attack. If you are looking at an attack with, say, a weapon, and again, in the military sense, a weapon is something that's very strictly defined, but in the lexical sense of things, it's probably not. And in the way that criminal law would regulate it, it's probably broader than that. So if you have a broad definition of what is offensive and what is a weapon, what an attack is, then you are looking at the stages of how do you categorize this conduct into phases? Where do you use different types of tools that could be a weapon in a crime? And frequently it's something along the lines of reconnaissance, access and penetration, internal reconnaissance and lateral movement, command and control, exfiltration and sanitation. Before we go into artificial intelligence, I would like to go back to this idea of an industrialized version of offensive tools. So if we look at how the industry that supplies offensive tools to governments is structured, it looks something like this. You have a security researcher somewhere. They might be employed somewhere and finding security flaws, and they might be taking that information outside of the mandate of their employed. They are they're insiders exfiltrating information they shouldn't be exfiltrating. They might be self-employed. And they might be looking for security flaws to get a bounty off of, or some type of payment for. And then these types of security researchers might sell that information to an exploit broker or vulnerability broker. They could also choose to sell it on a black market. When it's in one of these markets, it's going to be bought up by an intermediary. That intermediary is going to combine this technical know-how, the know-how of vulnerabilities and exploits, into a package where you have propagation methods. So you have the means of attack, you have the man in the middle, false Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, password cracking, you have social engineering techniques, combined with payloads and remote commands, such as data modification, real-time surveillance of keystrokes, audio, video, text, whatnot, whatever you can think of, basically. Combined with monitoring systems for the customer, where there's more advanced data analytics of text, language, image and object recognition, biometrics, anything that you might recognize from security products that you have. Training and consultancy, of course, on how to use this comprehensive solution, this monitoring system, and how to conduct the attacks. And that, of course, is used then by government authorities as offensive operations. And let's go to the example of AI. An interesting example because it has the giggle factor to it. It's a very old one called CyberLover from 2007, using natural language processing, allegedly, NLP, profiling users on Russian dating chat rooms, such as categorizing them as romantic lovers. And according to these profiles, it will adopt tailored language dialogue options to the profiles and gradually provide them with fraudulent links and conduct data thefts. And it was in the region of about one new relationship every 3 minutes. That's how fast it worked. And of course, much has happened since then. In a report that I published at the beginning of this year, for artificially intelligent cyber attacks, I categorized the different means of AI support that you can employ in the process, in the phases of a cyber attack. So, for example, for reconnaissance, you can have AI to conduct strategic intelligence collection or targeted profiling. Basically, you're using the AI here to understand things and synthesize information such as what are the trends in attacks today? What are the trends in mitigations? What are the weaknesses that CIOs, CISOs, etc. are blogging about that their companies have? Who are the people who have on LinkedIn and on other social media who have different roles in HR and other types of roles that you might want to attack? How are they connected to other people? And you gather this information, and at this stage, it's definitely dual use. If you want to understand something about security, you would use the same AI. This is an AI that's synthesizing information about vulnerabilities, weaknesses, mitigations. That's something that's good to have if you're a defender. just like if you're an attacker. You might use AI to detect vulnerabilities, well-known vulnerabilities, probably more so than 0 days, according to my findings at this stage of development at least. You might use AI to try to predict outcomes of how weaknesses, vulnerabilities manifest. You might use the AI to actually plan the attack with some type of attack tree and try to evaluate different options according to different types of parameters. You might have the AI, as in CyberLover, to conduct the phishing or even spear phishing, or generate attack codes on the basis of found vulnerabilities, to manipulate classifiers such as spam classifiers, to conduct different types of password attacks such as password cracking, guessing, brute forcing, to imitate human behavior to get around the CAPTCHA. You might have them map the network that you're attacking so that you get a better understanding and you can profile the behavior of the network so that you can imitate that behavior through network analysis. And then use smart lateral movements, which makes it harder to see how you are proliferating in the system and harder to detect what's going on, that something is wrong. You might use the AI to generate domains, to learn as it's in there. You might use some type of swarm-based command and control for bots. You might manipulate other AI solutions such as natural language processing and so on. And here's just, you look at the colored map here, here's just a few of those types of uses and how they connect to different technical methods, to different types of tools and solutions and technologies. And of course, when you look at a map like this, and you look at the refinement of how what started off as just knowledge about a vulnerability and then gets refined and connected to so many other technologies by bad actors into holistic surveillance systems. You have to start asking yourself with this vague idea of what offense really is. Well, so where do you draw the lines here? Which of these methods and technologies are offensive? When do they become offensive? Is it when they get combined? Is it only when they are designed for something specific? How specific? Does it have to be specifically a crime, or is it that they're easy to modify to be used for a crime later on? How do you identify these risks of misuse? And how do you come down in the end to say that what I'm dealing with is in the realm of what can be either offensive in itself or combined and augment something that is offensive? We have some legislative approaches to deal with. One of the traditional ones, as I noted earlier, which has been hotly debated, one of the main points of debate is export controls. If we look at the recent reforms and how they discuss misuse, they discuss the misuse of silent surveillance technologies in the context of serious violations of human rights, international law, internal repression, etc. This is what it is classifying as misuse and what it's trying to prevent these legal reforms. The regulation here it comes from policy, so multinational policy from the Wassenaar arrangement, and being mirrored then in EU law. So you're looking at the regulation of intrusion software. The end use that's being regulated is military, embargoed territory use, public use, again, used for public security threats, or used for human rights abuse. The types of equipment or items or information you're looking at protect is equipment, technology, software, know-how, schematics, drawings, code, anything, basically. that's relevant. That's a relevant component here. The capabilities that you are looking at is avoids detection or defeats a portion or extracts data, information, modifies system or user data with a standard execution path of program to allow the execution of externally provided instructions. With the reforms, you are trying to widen the concept here a bit. So intrusion software actually becomes a subcategory of cyber surveillance tools, including other things such as monitoring systems and other systems. And the way you widen this is by regulating against serious human rights violations, serious violations of humanitarian law, threats to international security, threats to essential security interest of EU or member states, terrorism. The capabilities you are looking at is basically technologies that enable the convert intrusion into information and telecommunication systems that can monitor, extract, collect, analyze, that can incapacitate or damage. And the status of this is it has some way to go yet, this legal reform. You have the Council and Parliament provisional agreement, and you have to go through some steps to reach the end result of a yes or no of how this is going to be done in the end. There are some challenges to export controls. How can we already have regulated this problem and still see European technologies being used in embargoed territories? Why does that happen? Well, one of the problems that you will meet is that this type of regulation, this type of policy is limited to the like-minded states, the ones in Wassenaar. They are subject to evasion. Companies try to get around them by lying or by collaborating with international oversight that somehow is not doing its job and giving them too much leeway. An example of that is, for example, hacking team with their hacking solution using general authorizations to export to countries like Sudan. How can that happen? I can't really give you an answer to that other than it's probably a failure of Italian oversight. It's probably a failure of the export control authorities. And unfortunately, there was public investment in this company as well. So that also looks bad for the Italian authorities, that you are co-investing into this and then not conducting appropriate oversight into how your authorizations are actually used in the end. The implications for you as a researcher here is that, well, you have to collaborate with the like-minded. If you want to keep the spirit of the law here intact, then don't go outside of the Wassenaar arrangement to find collaborators. Don't publish information in a way that gets to the unlike-minded. You probably have to adopt additional controls when collaborating with ineffective like-minded. It's not just enough to know that you're collaborating with someone who's in the EU. Are these collaborators that you have, or these contacts, are they actually mature enough to handle this information, to deal with this regulated know-how? Do they have the internal checks in place to manage this? And do their authorities actually take it seriously? Or are they one of the countries that don't take it seriously and are gonna let authorizations be abused? Assess the reliability of the partners. So basically what I said, look at also the internal system of the partners. What type of compliance do they have? How have they managed this? How have they built up a management system for this type of compliance? You also have misuse in the sense of cybercrime. You're looking at some specific technologies that are used intentionally and without right. You're looking at behaviors such as production, sale, procurement, use, import, distribution, making available of this type of technology. with the intent or purpose of committing an offense. And what are we talking about specifically? We're talking about illegal access to information systems, illegal system interference, illegal data interference. All of these are different forms of hacking in one way or another. The types of items or information you are dealing with is devices, computer programs, passwords, access codes, or similar data. Generally tools. And of course, the provision of any information that would be incitement, aiding, or abetting. And the capabilities of is access without rights. So it's a tool that is able to breach access rights or to go into a system that you're not the owner of and where you don't have consent, etc. You're looking at technology that seriously hinders or interrupts the functioning of systems, inputting computer data, transmitting, damaging, deleting, deteriorating, altering, suppressing, rendering inaccessible, etc. And that's what you're looking at for something which is a cybercrime. And I might add that the Council of Europe, with the Budapest Convention or Cybercrime Convention and the European Directive of Attacks Against Information Systems, they regulate this quite similarly. They are mirroring each other here. Some challenges to cybercrime. Well, if you read the recitals in the directive and if you read the subject matter of the convention, you see that this does not apply to public bodies. So, can the cybercrime regulations here actually, can they regulate something that a state is doing and is doing wrong? Like, say, a foreign state, say Russia. If Russia is using this against European citizens. Probably not. Maybe we have to see. That's what these complaints are for. And that's one of the reasons why they are taking time. And one of the cases, actually, American case law is starting to develop here or has developed here for some years, and they regulate it the same way. They also have this exemption for public bodies, and there the litigation hasn't worked. So we'll see if it might work in Europe in the future, but it doesn't seem promising, does it? It does not apply where there is authorization under national law. Could we see a case in the future, for example, where states, maybe small democracies, maybe medium-sized democracies that don't really have the means themselves to keep up in the international competition of offensive cyber, might be hiring companies to do this for them, to conduct offensive operations for them. Maybe, and if they're then authorized and the law is the same, then probably might not apply to such cases either. And there is information to suggest that some of these companies that conduct training and other types of support for the customers in repressive regimes might actually have, on occasion, been going into the level of detail in phishing operations or something similar, that they are actually partaking in offensive operations. They are helping repressive regimes conduct phishing against specific targets. The problem here is, of course, that the mere status of being a public body or having something authorized under law, it doesn't guarantee that you're a good public body. It doesn't guarantee that you're not a repressive public body, nor does it guarantee that in your authorization, legal authorization doesn't mean that your laws are good. So, do we have higher tests with better thresholds if we want to be responsible here? Well, I know that one of the tests that CIF frequently uses is the necessary in a democratic society test. So that's a higher threshold. Is this tool and the way it's designed actually necessary for a democratic society? Have the less intrusive alternative methods of conducting the operation or reaching the same goal been discounted before you commit an offensive operation? These are better tests. You can assess the partners association, looking, for example, at the European Data Protection Board's essential guarantees recommendations that were recently published. You can look at disclosures, try to see if people that you're associated with, companies that you're associated with, institutions you're associated with, or their associations in further down the line are actually known for delivering services to repressive actors, or simply maybe just known for having bad due diligence and not being capable of taking care of the information. You can conduct personnel checks. We have misuse in the sense of data protection, and I think that the case of by design here is specifically interesting. In recital 88, we are looking at misuse, personal data, defining whether personal data has been protected by appropriate technical protection measures, effectively limiting the likelihood of misuse. So basically fraud and other types of risks that I believe are regulated, for example, in recital 75 to the GDPR. And of course, these types of risks are the types of risks that you would take into account when choosing security measures, taking into account when doing your impact assessment, for example. And of course, if you use the same model of what's being regulated here to data protection, it doesn't become so interesting. But when you go into the data protection by design article, then what are you actually looking at? Well, you're looking at on the basis of nature, scope, context, the risks, their likelihood, and their severity. Adopt an appropriate means of protection. Do we have cases where, for example, personal data has been implicated in the type of misuse that I have been talking about previously? Well, I think maybe to some degree. An interesting case is one of the big telecommunications service providers in Sweden, Telia. They wanted to have a customer service solution, automated customer service solution, algorithmic solution. So they're looking for someone to make this solution for them. They find one of the actors that are leading on the market for voice analytics, for language analytics, and even for biometrics connected to voice. It so happens to be an Israeli actor. And they transfer a vast dump of customer service recordings in the Swedish language to this Israeli actor to train the system. This Israeli actor also happens to be a provider of surveillance tools, also hacking tools, and is combining those tools with analytics that have to do with biometrics, translation, voice to text. They also happen to be associated with customers in the Caucasus that conduct espionage against Sweden, in particular espionage against people who have fled those regimes and come to Sweden as asylees. We call that refugee espionage. Our espionage laws are wider than many other countries. We don't just see espionage against the the national interests, but also corporate interest and also asylum seekers' interest, for example. This personal data, could it have been transferred from one section of this Israeli company doing solutions to train customer service to the solutions of the customers? Or could the solution that the data then trained be transferred to these customers in the Caucasus who are then using it against targets in Sweden? Maybe, maybe not. It's probably not the most relevant data, to be honest. It's probably not the best training data to train a solution for intelligence purposes. It's probably quite appropriate for customer service. But in other occasions, you might deal with data sets that are potentially more modified or have been collected specifically for the purpose of training something in a security context. Now that's worth thinking about. And yes, some of the challenges here is, of course, the limited scope of data protection. It doesn't apply to national security necessarily. There are exemptions. The European Data Protection Supervisor sent out a call previously in 2015. The references below to police authorities in the EU saying, hey, this whole thing about intrusive surveillance solutions, let's have a discussion about that. And I guess the European law enforcement, the cool kids on the block said, no, let's not go to the nerds party. We don't want to associate ourselves with that guy. Then we wouldn't be cool. So I still have not seen anyone answer this call for discussion. The discussions 5 years later have not taken place. Processors are also frequently, actually I think it should be controllers, but neither the controller nor processor are frequently the designers. The design could actually be taking place somewhere else. So for example, by researchers or by a company and then supplied to police. So of course, if you're a researcher here, you would apply the design by design criterion both to the research part and to the end use part, irrespective of whether there's a national security interest. At the end of the day, though, how can you know if you are working with a government authority that is not just into public security or law enforcement, that they're not going to use, but they also have a national security mandate, that they're not going to use that later, use that exemption, and just take the technical research, disregard the legal design requirements, and implement that technology somewhere where you don't have the safeguards implemented? You don't know. At the end of the day, if you are uncomfortable with this, you're probably just going to have to say no to working with authorities and actors that are associated with exemptions where the legal protections don't matter. And just as a by the way, this the design criterion is not just data protection, it also applies to humanitarian law and non-derogable human rights in armed conflicts as well. So other possible legislative approaches is, of course, intelligence regulations. You regulate the end use, some of the end users, what they do. You can use counter-espionage regulations to try to get to the actors that are conducting espionage or that are supporting them. You can use vulnerability equities regulations to try to capture the need balance of how to disclose, how government authorities, the end users of these types of technologies are supposed to disclose vulnerabilities, whether when it's going to be for exploitation, when it's going to be disclosed to the public for security and patching. Mostly that has not worked out, though, because they tend to have exemptions for services or vulnerabilities disclosed by allies or given to them by allies and private companies, any place where there's a non-disclosure agreement. Public procurement regulations, investment screening and foreign takeovers regulations, confidentiality regulations, IT outsourcing, research ethics regulations. And some of the general mitigations that you have here as well. You are looking at the protection of information which is sensitive. So apply aspects of an information security management system. There are different types of standards that deal with this. Here I've just taken some of the types of aspects that might be relevant. You want to have responsibility. When was the last time you looked at the security policies or the information security policies of KU11? When did you read them last time? Do you know who is responsible for security at KU11? Is there a security team? Do they have an appropriate mandate to deal with these types of risks? You classify your information assets in your projects. You try to evaluate what risks they have, how severe they are, the likelihood, and you try to adjust your mitigations, and in accordance with the policies that you have in place, of course, in your organization. You report incidents. You make sure that they get to your security team, but also to the authorities that are responsible. You evaluate, you revise, and you improve. You learn new things. So I think that we have only a few minutes left. We should probably open up for questions, shouldn't we?